Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. This is our second webinar on mergers and acquisitions and exit plans within executive search. So if you came to our first one, thank you for coming again. If you're at the first one for you, then thanks for joining. Really appreciate your time because we know that it's an incredibly busy time for the executive search industry currently. We talk to about 250 executive search firms every month, and we've worked out now just over 75% of search firms are now looking for an exit, very seriously looking for an exit in the next 3 to 5 years. Whether those happen or not, we don't know at this stage, but there's certainly a massive appetite for it, much more so than there was 3 years ago. And that's really interesting as to why that's happened. We'll probably touch on some of that in the course of today. We're also speaking to many more firms that are looking to acquire other firms. And we also know that private equity is now, to some extent, interested in executive search, or at least some private equity companies are, whereas it was probably a sector that they avoided previously. So we won't be able to cover everything today, but this intends to be a deeper dive into exits and different types of exits and how to do those successfully and how to optimize value. And we'll try and cover as much as we can. We've also had some questions in advance, which we'll try and incorporate. And there's a chat function on the right of your screens. Please write any questions there, and I'll try and bring those in as much as possible. If we don't cover them, apologies in advance, and we'll cover them with you directly afterwards. Just contact us, and we can also arrange a consultation with you. Be very happy to do that if you've got any other questions or just want to talk about your individual situations. We're very happy to do that. So just to kind of introduce myself and the panel, I'm Tim Conley. I'm founder of ALC Enable, founded 21 years ago in 2001. And we offer strategic advice to executive search firms, and that's everything from branding, content. We coach and mentor search firm leaders, and then we help them with talent acquisition as well, in terms of hiring teams and individuals at all levels. We do that all over the world, and we've worked with all the big 5 Shrek firms, but we work a lot with smaller firms and mid-sized firms, primarily in Europe and the US, but also in Asia, Middle East, Australia, and we've even worked in South Africa. So I will now pass you on to the rest of the panel to introduce themselves. So I'll pass you to Katie first of all.
Thanks, Tim. Really good to be at my second ALC webinar. And I love this topic. I've spent most of my career, the first part of my career, or my first chapter as a partner at Deloitte, advising companies and management teams on optimizing exits and maximizing sale value. So it sits very much in my sweet spot. But latterly, as an investor, this topic has also been extremely important, yeah, it's something that is I know of great importance to hopefully everybody on the webinar today. So we shall cover a lot of ground. So that's me. I'll pass on to Philip.
Thanks, Katie, and hi everybody. Philip Ellis from Optima Corporate Finance. We're a corporate finance boutique based in London, and we focus exclusively on the human capital sector. So that covers contingent recruitment and executive search and HR tech. My first deal in the sector was 26 years ago, and of course we've seen lots of things over the years. We work with both acquirers and sellers, so we're used to looking at transactions from both sides of the table. So when talking to sellers, we know what it is that buyers will be looking for and how they'll see their business, which can often be quite helpful. So as Katie said, we've got lots to cover today, so I won't take up any more time now, and I'll hand you on to Gray.
Hello all, nice to be here as well. My name is Gray Hollett. I'm managing partner for global strategy at ALC Enable, and business partner with Tim. My background is 20 plus years as a strategic brand consultant, doing brand strategy, corporate identity design systems and launches for brands that many of you would know all over the world, perhaps. Then I subsequently spent nearly 14 years as Chief Marketing and Strategy Officer for Boyden World Corporation, where I headed up kind of business strategy as well as brand and marketing strategy for that organization, and also in partnership with the CEO, did a lot of work on acquisition, identifying targets, doing due diligence on those targets, and then incorporating them into the culture at Boyden. So,
okay, thanks. Thanks all of you. That's great. So we'll just get started. I just should add, just to finish off my intro, ALC Enable is involved in mergers and acquisitions now. We've done a few deals, but I predict, and I may fall flat on my face, but I predict that it's going to be our biggest activity in 12 months' time. We're having more conversations about exit plans and M&A than we're having about anything else involved in a search firm's strategy and growth. So it seems to be can be maybe a more efficient way of growth rather than hiring individuals in a very talent short market. But that is, of course, debatable. But we're certainly having lots of conversations and doing quite a few deals in this space. So, I mean, just to go to the panel now and just to talk about exit options, because what we tend to think about is a sale, an external sale, a trade sale. But I guess there's other types of exit options. Philip, I don't know if you're happy to start to look at these, to start talking about a few exit options and the sort of pros and cons of each as you see them.
Certainly. I think the first question actually that popped up from Moran was talking about any advice on selling to employees, and that of course is a very valid topic when thinking about exit, particularly within the executive search market. Whether that's to be described as an MBO, as it sometimes is, depending on the nature of the transaction. I think because of the continuity that provides, it's a less risky transaction than selling to an external party, because for the team and for clients, of course, there's no real change other than perhaps the leadership stepping away, whether that's in full or in part. So that's definitely an area that we expect to see more transactions taking place. We're involved in one exactly like that at the moment, in fact, and so I think that's key. Obviously, one of the determining factors is often that the employees may, or typically won't, have the capital available to acquire the business, and therefore that results in the necessity for some fundraising to facilitate the transaction. So I don't want to go into too much depth on one particular topic at the moment, and if we want to, we could perhaps come back to that a little later, but that's the principal issue that usually crops up when talking about management buyouts. How will management fund the purchase? The answer is that there are funding institutions out there, both of equity and debt nature, that are happy to look at these sorts of transactions to provide the capital that might be needed to fund this type of transaction. Lots of things will go into evaluating how fundable a deal might be, and I'm sure we'll cover those in the course of our discussion. But yes, as a starting point, apart from selling the business to an external competitor or somebody in a similar market, thinking about an MBO of some description is certainly one of the areas to think about.
Thank you. Is there anything you'd want to add to that, Katie, or any other types of exits that are worth mentioning?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Philip, and I know he's alluding to this without us getting into and spending half an hour on the MBO route, but the vendor buyout is also something that has cropped up and does crop up in the search world, where the funding actually is provided by the vendor in part, where the vendor takes their consideration out over time. So it is sold to the management team. The equity of the business is sold to management, but funded effectively by the cash flows of the business over time. That may or may not be with some external finance as well. So just to bear that in mind, that the buyout route also does include a vendor buyout alternative.
Okay, thank you. And what about, I mean, I mentioned private equity briefly. I know it's not been seen a lot in the search industry so far, but has anyone got any particular views on that, and whether there will be an increase in interest from private equity?
Well, as a private equity investor now, having sort of moved over to the other side, I would say, the risk factors from private equity are really around the fact that often without the team, the senior team, it's very difficult to look at an investment proposition that might be sustainable. Often if you've got a concentration of very, very solid fee earners, it's quite difficult. But I think there is a trend, Tim, and I think that's probably to do with the huge talent shortage, and particularly, I would say, in technology sectors as well, or STEM sectors, where it's perhaps looking at a sort of investment strategy where you are looking at a search business to provide the relationships into an organisation. You can see that with businesses like Norman Broadbent and lots and lots of others, where they sort of move down the pyramid a little bit. But actually, that could be a very interesting private equity investment story and strategy.
So just lastly on this point, then, with looking at it from a search firm owner's point of view, what do you think, Katie, that they should be looking at when looking at a private equity route? I mean, what are the sort of pros and cons, and what should they really be considering, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the key things with private equity is that you generally speaking, and there are hybrids, and 2020 Capital is actually one of those hybrids, which I'll come on to. But generally speaking, majority of private equity firms don't want to operationally run the business. So you remain as a management team autonomous, but that does mean that you need to have a strategy. And if for example, you are buying out the founder of the business, who may have been the CEO, you as a management team have got to have a strategy. You've got to be able to run the business, and if part of the financing is coming from an external institution, you've got to be very mindful of the fact that you can run that business and repay any capital or interest that's going to come down the pipeline. I think the other piece is, of course, that the majority of private equity firms have an exit horizon. So, I always used to call it, in my Deloitte days, the 1,000-day plan. So at the end of the 1,000 days, the private equity firm is probably likely to be looking at an exit or the exit strategy. So it's quite a short time frame. And the rule of thumb usually is that you've got to double your EBITDA in 3 years. So, you've got to have enough of a growth such that you can make a return for private equity, and private equity return hurdles are, let's say, between 2.25 and 3 times money multiples. So if you're putting £1 million in, you're going to want to get, let's say, 2.5 to 3 million back. So the financial plan is quite, it's got to be quite racy for private equity to get really interested. Maybe that you can only do that with a buy and build strategy, where you're buying other businesses to complement. Very often, the main issue with private equity looking at search businesses is that they just can't quite get the growth into the business in the time frame.
Okay, Great. That's fascinating. Thank you, all of you. And then just to come to Peter's point. So what Peter was mentioning in the chat here was, can we look at things from the buy side? What are they looking for? He mentioned size, type, industry or function, geography, etc. So we'll look at all of that because there's lots of elements I think to look at there in terms of what a buyer is looking for. But I'm also going to just start off just by involving Gray from a question that was asked before the webinar today by somebody, and she was asking about how is value measured besides revenue, profit, and we can come on to that a bit later. Is there a way to value a brand or a program? Was the question, Gray?
Sure.
To answer that.
It's funny because it's a question I've gotten for years and years from clients about how do you value brand, and it's actually, I've done a lot of work on it over the years, but mostly with publicly traded companies where you can actually do that. In professional services, it becomes a lot harder in some ways. Because you have to think about what is a brand. A brand is a perception, right? It's the experience that we all have with an organization, and that's a rather ephemeral thing. But you can look at it from both an economic side as well as from the emotional side and start to measure that. But it takes some commitment to do and some benchmarking. You have to kind of establish a baseline of where you're starting, and it's almost like I always say to professional services firms or smaller organizations, it's like, yeah, you want to think about your brand value, but are you investing in your brand at all? I mean, have you spent the time to do a brand strategy and really articulate what the brand is and how it behaves and how it's going to impact your organization? Most of them say no, or yeah, but they don't really understand what that means. So really the place to start is to actually thinking about the brand and developing that strategy and then implementing against that strategy. And probably at that point in time, also create a benchmark of things like familiarity and favorability, and then measure those over time. And you can understand what, one, the ROI on that investment is, but also what the impact is on your business as well. So it's a very hard thing to do in professional services, particularly I think the smaller the company, where a lot of the brand value doesn't necessarily reside in the name of the company perhaps, but in the lead partner or the founder of the firm as well. So those are difficult things to understand. They're quite anecdotal. I mean, a lot of the research we've done over the years on it is very qualitative in focus, and then you measure against that periodically to understand that.
Can I just come in there? It's very interesting from the investor side. A lot of private equity firms undertake what I would call brand due diligence, so that within the commercial diligence, and maybe this is slightly for larger businesses, but they very often, not being from the industry, undertake commercial diligence where the firm will ask customers whether they recognize the brand or are they dealing with the individual. So this is something that you can often see, and I would say though that they don't value, if you're at the positive end of that, i.e. you've got good brand recognition, what I've never seen is somebody add more value on for that. But what I have seen is the opposite, which is if you at the negative end, i.e. there's very little brand recognition of the business, it's like a binary decision. It's like, well, oh, okay, so this is just a group of individuals that are known to our customers, and that can put people off the acquisition altogether. So it's really interesting, Gray. I think when you're in the very, very large corporations, people do obviously get that brand strategy. And I think if you, as a smaller enterprise looking for a sale, could build up a brand strategy, a story, so that you're looking at it yourself and you feel comfortable that the business either has got a brand or it's on a journey towards that brand. It's one of the red flags for an acquirer. You've either got a brand, you're an institution, or are you just either the name above the door, or indeed just Jack or Jill or Bill or whoever it is the consultant. It's really important.
I think that's a really good point, because I mean, a lot of what Tim and I see when we're talking to firms is, okay, so, I mean, simple questions like, what's your business strategy? You know, they're thinking about their exit or a merger or an acquisition or a joint venture or something like that. And then we say, well, okay, so what's your business strategy? And it's funny because a lot will be like, oh, I have it. It's in my head, right? You know, and it's not down on paper. It's not articulated. And then it's not kind of inculcated into the organization. And that's the same with the brand strategy as well. It's, yeah, I mean, I know what my brand is. I know how to talk to people, but then it resides in that one person, and it's not kind of put through the organization from a messaging standpoint. It's interesting, Kate, that you say that, that it could not impact the sale price, but impact the negative side of that sale price to me, because that, as you said, you know, with public companies, brand value, familiarity, and favorability has significant impact on acquisition prices. So.
Yeah, I think that's really fascinating, and I think, you know, and it's about sort of clarity of purpose, isn't it, as well, and that links to, you know, many things. It links to culture and it links to, you know, where you're going. And I think from the many conversations that we've had with Philip and Gray, with firms that are looking to exit, I think that it, you know, essentially it's what, you know, it's also what's so special about you, because it is hard to differentiate yourself as a search firm. So why are your clients interested in you? Who are your clients? Why would they continue being interested in you in the future? And it's looking, as Philip always says, looking at risk. You know, what's the kind of future story? And that I guess does link to brand somewhat. So now I'm just going to sort of come to broaden it out then, because this is kind of the big piece of what we're covering today, which is really looking at it from a from the seller's point of view, in terms of, you know, how do you increase your value? What points need attention when you're looking at your firm and your strategy? Then we've had questions from Luke, that's talked about multiples, and have they changed over the last few years? Have they gone up or down? And then Ian has also asked about the question about whether contract, interim, book of business alongside search, and also contingency, whether that adds value to multiples. So lots of questions there. So I don't know, Philip, if you want to sort of start off on any of that, please.
Yes, thank you. Let's talk about the contract or interim bit first then. I think the answer to that is yes. That would help to enhance value, but only to the right acquirer. And what I mean by that is that a pure search firm that only wants to focus and specialise in the search market would undervalue contract or interim, but broadly, I think that diversification of income, and certainly having the future visibility of the annuity style income from interim or contract would generally be seen as a positive influencer on value. So I think that is the place to go. But if we talk about a pyramid in the market, and if the search piece sits at the top, I think it makes sense to look at interim, if we can call that the next step down. Try not to be politically incorrect in any of this. And then if we look at sort of contingent contract as the next step beyond that, and if we were to look at temp at sort of further down the food chain as well, there needs to be some linkage, I think, so it's joined up. So you wouldn't expect to see a firm that's searching at a high level also putting low value temps into a business. That wouldn't enhance value. But if there's a bit of let's call it vertical integration, perhaps, where a client could be serviced at more than one level, then I think that's definitely a positive factor, and something that I would encourage people to give some serious consideration to. Can
I add, Philip? I mean, I think we've seen this a lot. You know, very often the strategic relationships will reside much more at the search level than they do at the contingent level where you may be more discussing with the recruitment function as opposed to the C-suite. And I think, the value of pulling through, as you said, Philip, pulling through to the same client is even more enhanced where when you've got the search relationship, you can forward see the strategy of your customer, because then you can really tie in project work, being interim maybe, or indeed a contingent or a contract sort of piece. But I think it's having two separate businesses is not enhancing. I think that just confuses the customer a little bit on brand.
I really agree with that a lot, because I mean, what we used to look at is how did you integrate those businesses into your core competency? If your core competency is retained executive search, how is interim integrated into that? Or how are leadership consulting solutions integrated into that in support of the business? And that, from our perspective, enhanced the value. But if there was like a wall between those businesses, it was like, okay, so where are you really focusing?
Yeah, and I've seen this be a complete disaster where you put a search business with a more contingent model, and of course the commission schemes are very different.
Yeah.
And it becomes very difficult when you're trying to integrate when people have different commission and different cultures. Extremely hard to do.
I think trying to put that contingent. Yeah, sorry. Putting that contingent in the search that's much more of a disconnect from my perspective, where the interim perhaps wouldn't be potentially. So.
We've worked on deals where search firms have acquired contingent businesses or partly acquired them, so that when they're placing people in the boardroom and are then presented with the opportunity to help build teams, they're able to say yes rather than no. Where it's been most successful, it tends to be where branding have been kept separate and where management of the contingent businesses have stayed in post and continued to do what they're doing. They've just got a different level of reach into those clients. So I agree. I think trying to mix it all together would be a difficult thing to do successfully.
Okay, thanks. I just want to zero into a very specific question which Jack asked, and I think Simon also said he was interested in this too. It's very specific. I hadn't heard specifically before, but I think I can at least half answer it, and then maybe somebody else can contribute. Jack was asking about, are there any preferred candidate contact databases being used in targeted executive search firms which seem to be preferred by acquiring organizations? So, I mean, I feel that technology and executive search is very, very disparate, and I think it's really advanced the last 3 years, but it's come from a long way behind its contingency cousins, and also a long way behind most other industries that it serves. Like a lot of aspects of executive search, I think it, in terms of diversity, it's got a long way to go. In terms of kind of culture and looking after people, but I think it's fast accelerating and improving. But the technology space is really, really disparate. I would say, I don't know if Philip, you've got a view, but I would say that probably the most important aspect potentially is that they've got a similar or ideally the same system that can really help. But I think in terms of specifics, I think we've studied this, and we've got some knowledge about technology. We've got some advisors who specialize in that, if you're interested in speaking to them. But it seems that Ezekiel is stealing the march on Invenius. That's the sort of headline, but everyone feels very strongly about their own CRM. Like most things in the executive search industry, people have strong opinions, so people might have different opinions on it. But I don't know if you've got anything else to add, Philip, or if you've seen anything else at all that would answer that.
Well, I haven't, and I think I would suggest that a business should make the decision on its technology as to what's best suited for that business, rather than trying to implement a system because it might make them more attractive to a potential acquirer. Because I don't think it's so clear cut that anyone could say, if you've got that system, you're going to be more attractive to a buyer, and chances are different buyers are using different systems as well. So that's not something, from my perspective, not something where I've ever suggested or could see myself suggesting go down a particular route with the technology decision because it's going to make you a more attractive target. I don't know if anyone else has seen anything differently.
Yeah, I think from my perspective, it's a cost of entry today, where it wasn't perhaps 8 or 10 years ago to have that CRM solution in place. The biggest challenges I've seen in my past is that the integration. So you acquire a firm, and integrating 2 different legacy systems can be a significant effort and take a lot of time and a lot of cost in doing that as well. And as Tim said, those are kind of emotional decisions. Everybody thinks their system is the best and that kind of thing, and it can be a challenge. But as a preferred, there's some real dogs out there from the CRM system, but there's some really good platforms as well. So,
can I know it's slightly to the side, but I think for me the value of the system is in how you use it rather than the system itself. So most of these systems, are should, as long as you're using something that is that's just out there and a lot of people are using, that they do sort of do broadly the same sort of thing in a CRM. But I think how you use that system and the ease of use, if it's rubbish in, rubbish out sort of thing. I think the value comes in the data. So some of the systems that I've looked at where people have produced data to present their business, it's great if that data is accurate. It is a disaster if it's not. So I think if you're presenting data out of your system, it is really critical to make sure that everybody in the business is using it properly.
Okay, thanks. That's interesting. So, Katie, if I may, just to dive into the really sort of probably one of the toughest questions is, how do you reach an evaluation of a search firm, and then if you could just add a couple of key points that you feel can really help if a search firm owner is looking to sell in the next 2 or 3 years, what can they do, if anything, to increase that valuation?
So I think it sounds a little flippant, but I do stick with this, that the valuation, really what we're talking about is price rather than valuation. So people talk about a valuation, but they don't really mean valuation. What they really mean is, what is the price that somebody's prepared to pay for my business? Mm-hmm. Because we could all do a very theoretical valuation on what a business should be worth using complicated valuation techniques, but actually it's really what the price that somebody's prepared to pay for it, and that price has a lot of different angles to it. One is the synergies that can be sought from the seller and the acquirer. Some of it might also sit around how much working capital is required. I mean, in search businesses usually not significant, but I think there's an awful lot of considerations around price. Very often people start with a rule of thumb. So search firms, in my experience, have tended to start with 1 times their net fee income, and that might go up depending on sort of strategy, synergy. But certainly the Shrek firms, that's always the sort of value they used to start with. If you're looking at an EBITDA-based valuation rather than a net fee income-based valuation, very often you will find that something like a 5 times EBITDA is a lot more than 1 times net fee income, depending on how the structure of the business is. So smaller businesses where you might have very, very high net fee income per fee earner, in the millions. Very often it's very hard to look at the two components. So it is quite a complicated, it's a little bit more complicated, I would say, than perhaps in the contingent world, where people do look at EBITDA and they look at conversion from net fee income to EBITDA. I think in the search world, there's a lot more going on into that price point. I think, though, what are the positive valuation drivers? I think where you've got a low concentration in customers. So obviously, if 80% of your revenue comes from one customer, that's going to drive you down the valuation scale. Equally, if 80% of your revenue comes from a very small number of fee earners, that equally is a very risky proposition for an acquirer. It's much better to have a lower net fee income per fee earner and have that spread out than have it concentrated. I think also, and it's a bit comes back to the database point. Do your customers have more than one touch point to the firm? So even if you've got a very broad set of fee earners, but it's one fee earner per customer, again, very, very risky. Lose the fee earner, you lost the customer. So there's some it's really about industrializing the business, making sure that you've got a robust customer base, and if you lost a couple of customers, it's not going to change hugely. And also, I think usually fee earners are remunerated based on the net fee income that they derive, and that could be from an existing customer. I think new customer acquisition is something that, if that is rewarded and incentivized in the business, and you keep adding on new customers, again, very, very valuable, and the price will go up. But there's a lot of rule of thumbs there, and it is quite an art. And you've got to market your business extremely well, and you've got to understand what your uniqueness is in the market. What are you leading with? Are you leading with customers? Are you leading with candidates? It's really important to know why somebody is going to want to acquire you and why you would be valuable to them.
Thank you.
Can I add a couple of things to that? I think I absolutely agree with everything which Katie has said. I think that's all spot on. Just to take one of the points a little further, if you as the owner and the person that's intending to sell the business are still a significant fee earner, that's even worse news, because why would a buyer be interested in writing you a cheque to let you go when you're still responsible for a large portion of income? And that is a more common feature within search than contingent recruitment as well. So I think an important point to consider if you are planning an exit is to try and hand your relationships over, make sure the business isn't all about you as best you can, make yourself redundant from the business in terms of its reliance on you, so that there's a sustainable value to the business and it's not just about you producing an income for yourself. The other thing I would add, and touching on one of the questions which came in from Gary about specialists versus generalists, I would say every time industry specialism will command a greater value. So if you've got a diverse set of people working with you, and two are working in technology and two are in healthcare and one's doing finance, and there's nothing really coherent and cohesive about it, you might find two identical profit and loss accounts, but the value will be significantly different. So focus on a market, become known for it, develop the brand, coming back to that theme within the market, and be a specialist, and think very carefully about diversifying away from that, because you might put a pretty number at the bottom of the profit and loss account, but a pound of profit isn't necessarily a pound of value. So definitely specialism would get my vote every time.
Yeah, and mine. I'm just picking up on Jason's point here, whether integrating or merging with other firms to maximise scale and value. I mean, I think as specialism commands a premium, so does scale, because I think with scale, you usually have dealt with the concentration aspects. So you've got more customers, more fee earners. But I would say that doing an acquisition or merging is a specialist thing. Not everybody is as good a search business as they are necessarily an M&A boutique, and it is quite a risky proposition if you're thinking of a sale and you're pinning your sale hope on being bigger. You've just got to make sure that 1 and 1 is 3 or 4 rather than 1 and 1 is 1.5. So I think we've all seen mergers of search businesses where you suddenly find the cultures don't fit and everybody leaves, and that is a very difficult. So yes, scale is important and can command a premium, but it is a risky strategy in my view.
Yeah.
Okay, just on that subject of culture, because it's an interesting one, and I think culture has come to the fore, particularly during COVID, where search firms have had to look after their people well, and they have, and to their credit, I think they really have during COVID, and given more attention to how people work at various levels. Gray, do you think there can be anything, and it's hard to equate culture to value or price, as Katie says, but is there anything, do you think, Gray, that can be done in terms of looking at culture and the brands of the company to protect it and enhance it for a sale, do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think there is. And I think culture, particularly if you're thinking about a merger or an acquisition, people need to be on kind of the same page when it comes to culture. I'll go back to something that Philip said a moment ago, which I think is what you and I see quite a lot, is that the value, the brand, the culture is all resident in that one largest fee earner or the founder, whomever that is. And the real challenge, I think, is how do you transfer that value into whatever the company brand is. I mean, we talk a lot about in professional services that when you're thinking about branding and brand strategy, there's really 2 components to it. Unlike, like a Boeing or another, B2B type of business, because you have both the company brand as well as what I call the partner brands that are equally important in professional services in many ways. And I think that you have to really think about that interaction. But culture, I think, is critically important. And can you impact culture? Yes. It's just like any other kind of strategic, looking within activity is, okay, well, what type of culture is it that we want to have? What does that mean in terms of how do we treat the people who work for us? What are their expectations? What are their needs? And certainly, I think, to your point, COVID has impacted that a lot because now people are demanding, working from home 2 days a week or 4 days a week or whatever that is. And managing that can be very difficult and have a huge impact on company culture, particularly, I think, in this business, which is has been so office focused, which has always kind of puzzled me a little bit as to why, but it's been so office focused that, cultures are just changing radically. So.
Thanks for that. I think that there's lots more to say about enhancing value, but I think we've touched on quite a few kind of key points. But please do come back to us if you need more information on that. I just wanted to move on to something else now, which is a great question from Oscar, which is how do we approach potential buyers? I mean, just quickly from my side. What I've seen, I think Katie touched on this earlier, we've seen lots of deals go awry in the executive search industry, and I think that's why, understandably, there wasn't too much appetite for it or for M&A. But I think that was partly like not paying attention to culture, just looking at the price tag and nothing else in terms of processes, culture, brand, etc. Not really giving enough attention to it. And I think the other, just from our side, is search firms just going to the first buyer or the second buyer, but not doing a search. You would never accept a candidate who just approaches you, you'd search the whole market, and you'd sell that to your client that you're actually looking at the whole market to find the very best candidate. Well, it kind of, to me, it makes very clear and simple but logical sense that that's what you do to find the right buyer as well. But I don't know if any of you have got anything else to say in terms of how do you approach potential buyers and how do you find the right buyer?
Well, first word that springs to mind is carefully, but you probably want a bit more flesh on that bone. I think you may find yourself on the receiving end of an approach from a prospective acquirer, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it does mean that the potential acquirer is in the driving seat, and they'll know if you haven't prepared information and aren't in discussion with other parties. And of course, this is work that we do, so I'm pretty familiar with it. So I'm not going to say to you that you shouldn't engage in those discussions and you shouldn't entertain them, but it doesn't mean it's the right buyer just because they happen to have approached you. And I think it's important to be disciplined in that. And if you feel it's not right, don't just be sucked into it. If the intention is to go to market, I think there's a lot of preparatory work required so that you can present good quality information to prospective acquirers. They will then know that you're serious about it. You've taken the time and the trouble to prepare that information. I would always suggest engaging advisors so that you don't have to have that direct dialogue and you can draw on experience. And it's a long and time-consuming process. So if somebody is considering an exit, you do need to be prepared for that, and you'll need to make sure that whilst it's ongoing, you don't take your eye off the ball in terms of how the business is performing. That's a sort of classic banana skin that the buyer says, well, how have the last couple of months been? And you actually find you've been performing below expectation because your attention has been diverted to the transaction itself. So there is a lot of preparation to do, lots of potential risks and pitfalls to avoid, and so managing the release of information and managing the negotiations, these are all well-trodden paths, but without the benefit of somebody guiding you through them, it can become a little treacherous.
Yeah, I'd just like to follow on, Tim and Philip. The other thing which I think as sellers you should be very aware of is what I would call the reverse due diligence. So there's an awful lot of buyers that might approach you to get information. They might be interested in buying your business, but they ultimately might be also contacting the next 20 people in the alphabet. So I think one of the things that you could do is to say, well, ask some questions like, well, what is it about my business that you particularly think is interesting? Why would you want to buy my business? So I think very often people get sort of wooed a little bit with the first approach and even in a process without actually thinking or asking, how much does the buyer really know about your business? Have they done a lot of work? If they've done a huge amount of work and a lot of research, then they're probably more serious. And it's always the danger when you are preparing a business for sale and you write an information memorandum. Everybody wants it, of course. As an investor, if somebody phones me and says, I've got a business for sale, would you like the information memorandum? I'm going to say, yes. Sure, I'm going to have a read, and but very, very rarely do I find that there's a huge amount of care around. Do I really want to buy a business in this sector or geography or that looks like this? So,
thank you. And if you weren't using us, for example, to help you find the right buyer and to do a kind of completely holistic look at the market. Where would you focus on geographically? I know there might not be a straight answer, one answer for this, but where would you focus on geographically? What size of firms should you focus on in terms of potential buyers? Are there any clear answers to any of these questions?
I think a lot of that will depend on the size of the business. So it always sounds quite sexy and exciting, the idea of an international sale. But if the reality is it's a small business, it's unlikely that somebody from overseas is going to be that interested in trying to run it and manage it remotely if there isn't sufficient scale. So I think size will help to determine that quite a lot. And then it depends which markets you operate in and where your clients are based. There may be very sound reason if you're in a particular market and some of your clients are, let's say, UK and US based, to have a conversation with a US acquirer. But if that isn't the case, then of course it wouldn't make sense. So I think it is a very difficult question to answer at a general level. It's about understanding the specific drivers within any particular business to then think about the strategy and who as an acquirer might see the greatest strategic value in acquiring the business, because coming back to that word price, that's where the price will be driven upwards.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you. And then just lastly, and then we can probably go back to a couple of questions if we have time, and feel free to ask any more questions in the chat if you'd like to. But post deal, I know, Gray, you've talked about culture quite a lot and team dynamics, but as we know, a lot of the deals have gone wrong in the past, in my view, because not enough attention's been being taken in terms of looking at the actual makeup of the organizations, and the motivations and kind of clarity of purpose between the two organizations to see if they are if they can blend together. But Gray, have you got any views in terms of kind of post deal, what can actually increase the chances of maximum success for everybody? Because often part of the deal is coming from revenue anyway, so it's in everyone's interest, of course, that the integration's done as smoothly and as successfully as possible. But have you got any views as to what can really help that?
Well, yeah, I think a lot of the due diligence seems is very focused on the financials as well. I mean, we've talked about thinking about cultural alignment and those types of things. So a lot of I think that the work that gets done up front in figuring out, okay, can we actually work with these people? Or, do they align certainly from a sector focus or a geographical focus, or fulfilling a need geographically that we don't have currently, or that type of thing. But that the pre-work also on what I might call the softer side of a deal, right, is who are the people? Do we like them? Are we culturally aligned? Are our skill sets compatible or complementary as well? So that on the back end of the deal, that kind of onboarding component can be a huge challenge. And I think if you've done a lot of that work up front, it makes it a lot easier. But how do you integrate different teams? We talked about technology before. Integrating different technology platforms can be a huge challenge and costly challenge for an organization. So really getting a plan in place for what does the first week look like? What does the first month look like? What does the first 6 months look like? And how do we manage that? Just like firms manage onboarding of new employees. It's going through a lot of the same steps. The training. Okay, what is company A? What's our philosophy? What are our values? What's our mission? What's our brand? And whose brand is going to be the lead brand, if any? Or do you go through a renaming exercise, or those, or a rebranding exercise? Those are all big decisions to be made and need to be thought about in the course of doing all of the other due diligence that goes on and considering a deal. And I think this is true with joint ventures as well. Thinking through, how will that venture actually work as well. So it's kind of like why I liked at the beginning, we were talking about the MBOs. That makes it almost easy in some ways, right? In terms of kind of succession planning and those types of things. So
yeah, it's more controlled, I suppose, in a way. But I guess in an obvious sense, you can get the people better, don't you? You know their motivations and understand their purpose better, don't you? So
yeah, and they've been immersed in that organization for a while, so they get it, right? And these are the soft components, the ephemeral kind of elements that you just kind of intuitively start to understand in time.
But I think you're right. I think that understanding, getting that deep understanding of somebody's motivations from both sides is imperative. So I think as Philip used the word carefully. How do you approach the buyer? Carefully is really carefully and gradually to really get to know each other. I think.
Well, and the other thing too about brand and brand strategy to me is a lot of people think of that as an external issue, and it's not. It's an internal issue.
Yeah.
That's critically important to remember. Everybody needs to be on the same page. There needs to be an evangelist if you have a board of directors, or the founder is controlling everything. That founder has to be that evangelist through the organization.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Just lastly, probably Claire's asked a couple of different questions, both very interesting questions. I'll tell you what they both are, and then we'll look for hunt for some answers. But one of the questions was, is a diversity-focused search firm seen as more valuable these days? Which is kind of quite interesting. And then her other question was relating to, we touched on it in terms of specialist versus generalist, but she's asking specifically, are there particular sectors or focus or industry sectors that are seen to be more valuable, or likewise others that are seen to be less valuable? I don't know if you want to tackle that question, Philip, that question about sectors that are seen to be more valuable, potentially.
I think Katie mentioned before that technology is on everybody's lips. It's not going away. It's going to continually evolve, and I think therefore it makes it very resilient and strong. I think probably safe to say that healthcare may fall into that category as well. There's substantial shortages, not just on the coalface but everywhere, I think. So those would be two that jump out at me. But apart from that, I think if you've got a strong presence and a strong niche or brand in a particular sector, that will be attractive to somebody. It'll be attractive to everybody, but finding the right buyers. So if I had to pick out a couple of sectors, it would be probably technology and healthcare, but I wouldn't want anybody that's not in those sectors to be disappointed by that answer, because if you can make your business strong and resilient and well known in its market, then there will be people that will find that attractive.
Yeah, and I guess there's a market for any industry, because that's why it exists. So somebody's going to be interested in that. I mean, on the diversity question, it's something I'm very passionate about, and we've just recently published the first DEI report for the search industry itself, because we feel that the search industry has got a privileged place to be able to lead diversity. So and I know lots of you are passionate about diversity in the search industry and doing some great things for your clients, but the only thing that we can affect in our business is the search industry itself, and it's sadly, shockingly behind other industries, actually, even behind most other industries. But encouragingly, in the last 3 months, I've had 6 firms reach out to me personally and ask me to increase their diversity in their own organization, particularly at the top level. So I think that's positive. I don't know, I'm not close to it enough, and maybe it's not proven yet, and we need a year or two to see the results. But I don't know if it's going to have any impact on value. I don't know if any of you have got any views on whether that has got impact on value. I would have hoped it would have, but I don't really know.
Yeah, I mean, from the private equity world, I mean, you are now really only going to be able to raise money as a private equity house if your ESG agenda is solid. Now, that might not just be diversity, but it is one of the main, I think there are 17 that United Nations put out as being the ESG goals for organisations, but diversity is certainly one. I think we need to remember diversity isn't gender. It really, for me, is more around the fact that you are inviting difference of thought. We focus very much on, gender and race and all those sorts of things. But for me, diversity is really allowing people to bring their own ideas, and we're getting a real mix of talent into the gene pool of an organisation. But I think, Tim, when you think about private equity, and it will become the same, I think, with corporates over time. Particularly, I mean, you see it anyway in the FTSE and the listed ones. Unless you have businesses that have strong ESG protocols, it's going to be very difficult to invest in them.
Okay, well, thank you. I think this has been a really great hour. I hope everyone's enjoyed it. I'm very, very grateful to so many people for attending. Had a great turnout, and we really tried to address all of the questions. I think there's a couple that I missed, but I will get back to those individuals. We've taken a note of your questions. We will get back to you, and hopefully you'll have some more questions which you can come back to us and ask us at any time. We've really enjoyed hosting this, and thank you to all of the panelists. I'm really grateful to you, Katie, Philip and Gray, and hope you all got something from it, and hope you managed to use some of your knowledge, and please feel free to speak to us at any time, and have a good rest of your day, and have a good end to your week, and thank you so much for attending.
Thanks, Tim.
Yeah.
Thanks, Tim.
Thanks. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks all.
Bye.